Good morning. As you know, the world is going through a financial crisis. Now here's a chart that shows our country and 5 other OECD countries. OECD, as you should know, is a collection of developed and, well, sort of developed countries. What is interesting about this table is when you look at the growth rates of the economies of these 5 OECD countries, or 5 other OECD countries and ours, we are a member too, okay? What you see is, well, the 5 that I picked, or the 5 countries that had massive financial sector problems. Now, the financial crisis is, well, it's 2 words, right? Financial crisis. Does anyone know what a crisis is? I bet you do, but maybe not on a Monday morning at 8:30. Financial crisis is a little trickier. Financial means having to do with finance. And we're going to spend quite some time this semester thinking about what finance is and why we care about it. But you have some feeling. And for the moment, think of this as banks failing, right? None of the Turkish banks failed, and we didn't fear that they would fail. However, Belgium had massive bank failures. Netherlands had massive bank failures. Ireland was almost wiped off the map. They had so severe banking problems. The United Kingdom had banking problems the way they hadn't seen since Victorian times. And the United States, obviously, is the beginning of all of these problems. And their financial system was almost dead altogether, okay? So we have 5 countries here that had huge problems with their financial sectors, okay? And 1 that did not. And we're looking at their growth rates in the first half of 2009. It must strike you that the country that did not have a financial crisis had the worst performance of all of them. Why? That is a great question. We're talking about a financial crisis, but we did not see many financial problems in our country. Nonetheless, 2009 was a terrible year. Why was it? And what was so terrible about it? I mean, we know that it was bad, right? You know, you're living in this country, you read the newspapers, you know that, life sucks for everyone. But why? Here's another chart. This one shows the per capita, that means per head, per person, incomes in Greece and Turkey since 1950. Greece is the top line, and Turkey is the bottom line. It says in 2005 dollars. In 1950, the average Greek per year earned about $2,000 more than the average Turk. In 2007, the average Greek earned about $20,000 more than the average Turk. Why? The average Greek has 2 arms and 2 legs. Greece is a Mediterranean country. Indeed, as you may know, we share a border, right? And something happens when you move from one side of the border to the other side of the border that makes you $20,000 richer per year. What is it? What is it that Greece did right and Turkey didn't? Well, this is Introduction to Macroeconomics, and these are the things that we're going to be talking about this semester. Macroeconomics is a great field of study because it allows us to make sense of the world around us. Indeed, that's most of what university education is. Now, what I would like to do is, given that I have your attention now, and I've given you some taste of the beautiful questions that we tend to work with, I'd like to work with those questions a little bit first, and then talk about the class design and how things will work and blah, blah, blah. Okay? So the first question here is, let's think of this. Per capita income. What is it? What do you think is charted here, is plotted here, or here? Our country shrank 11% in the first half of 2009. Now, what exactly is it that got smaller? Did you shrink 11%? Probably not, right? You know, geographically, we're still the same country. We didn't get smaller, okay? So what are we talking about? When we say, you know, look at this, Turkey did terrible. There's a number, right? Obviously, we are able to count something and say, you know, this thing is 11% smaller, and that's bad. But what is that thing? What are we talking about? When we say the Turkish economy, that's what it is, the Turkish economy got 11% smaller, okay? What is that measure of the Turkish economy? So our first question here is having some measure of what we mean by Turkey did well, Turkey did badly, okay? We have high income, we have low income. Macroeconomics means we're not looking at a single person. We're not looking at the production of a firm, okay? We're looking at a country. We're looking at a collection of people, okay? We're looking at collection of goods. Now that makes life, at least to me, more interesting, right? You get to ask the big questions, but also in some rather narrow sense more difficult. Because when we're talking about, say, the production of milk, right? When I say Turkey produced 11% less milk last year, okay? It's extremely clear what I'm talking about. We know what milk is. We know, where it comes from, right? Many of you grew up in cities, so did I, but we know where it's supposed to come from, okay? And we know that it's measured in liters, gallons, whatever, but there's a physical measure of this thing, and when I say we produced 11% less of this, you understand what it is that we produced 11% less of, okay? But when I said Turkey produced 11% less, okay, what am I talking about? So in macroeconomics, our first question is defining the items that we're interested in, okay? Our first question is the measurement question. It's answering questions of the sort, over the last 5 years, our country did well, or not, okay? But what is the metric? How do we measure this? Obviously, you can think of many, many dimensions in which to measure this, in terms of education, in terms of women's rights, in terms of, the national football team, you name it. But we're economists, at least for today, okay? So we want to think of some measure of economic well-being. And of course, having grown up in this country, you understand the difficulty of adding different things up, right? Because what we're looking for is some measure of the total production of our country, right? So I want to add things up. And the reason this is difficult is, I could ask you, does our country produce apples? Yes. Very good. Do we also produce oranges? Yes. Okay. Now, we produce apples and oranges, and this is going to be important in a moment. And we produce a zillion different kinds of goods. Now, one thing we could do is we could keep track of each single good, okay? We could ask, compared to last year, how many oranges did we produce? How many apples did we produce? How many cars did we produce? How many hours of ECON102 lectures did we produce? Right? Production doesn't have to be production of physical items. We produce services too. We produce haircuts. We produce lectures, right? We produce musical concerts. These are all production. Now, when we say the Turkish economy shrank by 11%, are we saying each one of these things is produced 11% less? It probably doesn't have to be, right? So it's kind of average. And this is where the great question comes up. How do we average apples and oranges? Okay, because, so in English this is, you can't add apples and oranges. Right, in Turkish, you were in like first grade when your teacher told you, you can't add apples and pears. right? If we can't add them up, how can we average them? So what we are going to do is we're going to spend this week thinking about this exact question, okay? How are we going to come up with some measure of what our country produced? This is not an easy question, okay? And we do have an answer for this. It's not the best answer one could, well, it's the best answer that I can give, but it's not a problem-free answer. The way we approach this problem, the problem of not being able to add up haircuts and cars, is to say, well, the problem is in the units. You know, it's one haircut, one car, they don't add up, okay? So what I could do is turn these things into units that are compatible, that I could add up, okay? How would I do that? Well, while we cannot add up apples and oranges, we can add up values of apples and values of oranges, okay? You can't add up a kilo of apple to a kilo of orange. But you could say, well, a kilo of oranges is 5 liras worth of oranges. A kilo of apples is 10 liras worth of apples. I could add 5 liras and 10 liras. And in fact, given my amazing mathematical powers, I could come up with 15 liras. Okay? Now I could say, we produce 15 liras worth of apples and oranges. This idea turns out to be an extremely powerful one. Okay? A country's, or the economists' measure of a country's production is what is called the GDP. Does anyone know what this stands for? Go ahead, man. Gross domestic product. You may have noticed this class is going to be in English proper, but I do want to make sure that you know the terminology in Turkish too. So let's write this up first. What we're talking about is the gross domestic product. What is this in Turkish? Gayri safi milli hasıla. So 3 words. Which of this corresponds to milli? Your English doesn't have to be great to know that domestic is not milli, right? Okay, so this thing is, and you should know this, okay? We're talking about gayri safi yurt içi hasıla. And we're going to talk about why this is different. The thing that you're talking about is gross national product, okay? Now, the gross domestic product, I'll give you a definition, okay? And you should understand this definition. This is something you can memorize, okay? But if you memorize it, it's not going to do you any good. The concept is something very useful, all right? The gross domestic product is, hear me out first for a second. I will write it down, okay? It is the monetary value, and now you understand why that's important, right? It's the monetary value, rather the total monetary value of the final goods and services produced in an economy in a year, okay? This is a slightly sloppy definition because it doesn't have to be a country and it doesn't have to be a year. I could think of Ankara's gross domestic product in the second quarter of 2010, okay? But it has to be a well-defined geographical location, right? We have to understand what this domestic refers to. Are we talking about Ankara? Are we talking about ECON102? Are we talking about Turkey? Are we talking about Europe, okay? Gross domestic product can be defined and calculated for all of these. And then the question is, okay, I'm gonna add up the values of things I produced. Okay, since when, right? Since Adam and Eve? Since the foundation of the Republic? Yesterday? Okay, you have to decide the production over what period of time. Usually we're interested in the year. It must be very clear to you that mechanically, practically, calculating this number is incredibly difficult. You have to keep track of everything that you produced right? What their values are, add those up. You can't do this every day. In fact, you can't do this every month. This is an inhumanly difficult task. So in all countries, this is done 4 times a year for each quarter of the year, okay? So the gross domestic product is the total monetary value of final goods and services produced in a country in a given time period. Let's talk about the components of this definition. You have a book, and the book is not a very good book. None of the introduction to economics books are very good. But all of them are good for things of this sort, okay? You're going to find a definition of the gross domestic product in any economics book that you're going to open. So, memorizing this definition or making sure that you've learned all of the words in it isn't what you're supposed to do in this lecture, okay? You have to understand what it is that we're trying to do. You can open up the book and come up with the definition anytime you want. So, keywords here are, this is a keyword, total, okay? We're trying to add things up. That was the whole point, okay? We're trying to add up our production of, suggest a good. Tell me a good. Apple. Extremely creative. I applaud you. Suggest a service.
Service like a hospital?
Very good. Excellent. Health. Okay? So we're trying to add up production of apples to production of open heart surgeries. We produce both of these in our country. Okay? The total value of these things. That's the total. It has to be the total monetary value because otherwise we cannot aggregate them. Aggregate, okay? Aggregate is the verb form, right? When you're using this as doing it, it's aggregate. The noun form is aggregate. Macroeconomics is about aggregates. It's about sums. It's about big things, right? So it's about the aggregate production. It's about the aggregate prices. It's about the aggregate employment. It's not about my employment, my unemployment, okay? That's microeconomics. It's not about the, suggest a good. Cars. It's not about the production of, say, Toyota cars in Turkey, right? That's micro. That's one firm. It's about the production of everything. It's about the employment of everyone. Okay? That's what aggregate is. To talk about aggregates, we have to aggregate things. We have to add things up. We have to add people up. We have to add prices up. We have to add quantities up. Okay? This is the quantities bit. We're trying to come up with a measure of what we produced. Okay? It turns out we can't do that. But we can do, what we can do is coming up with a measure of the value of what we produced, okay? That's the monetary value. Final goods and services, let me come back to this final bit, okay? The goods and services is important because we're almost hardwired to think about, when we say production of physical entities, right? When I say production, you have a factory in mind, right? This machines producing stuff, people running around, blah, 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 right? And it's important to note that that's not what we're talking about, or that's not only what we're talking about. It's the production of everything. And this is going to be your homework very soon. Our country included, many of the, except the very poor countries, the production of services is extremely important. This is a huge part of what we produce, okay? So we produce a lot of, for example, restaurant services, right? Whenever you go out and eat out, okay? What you're buying isn't just goods. Most of what you're buying is services. Why is that? Because you're not buying, when you buy a tomato soup, okay? You're not just paying for the tomato and the butter and the flour and the water, right? You're paying for somebody's services in putting them together in a special way, okay? It's somebody's serving you that soup. So it's goods and services. Whenever we talk about the macroeconomy, we're talking about goods and services. Throughout the semester, I'm going to be very sloppy. I'm going to keep on saying goods just because it's easier. But whenever I say this, I always mean goods and services, goods and services. The stuff that we produce. Okay. Produce in a country, this is easy, right? We're trying to come up with where the production is done, when the production is done. Okay? The given time period is, you specify a time period. Okay? I tell you, in, say, October, November, December of 2009, this is the fourth quarter, the last quarter of 2009, okay? The Turkish economy recovered some. Now, what does that mean? Now we have some understanding of what it means, right? It means, by this definition of what we produce, okay, the last quarter of 2009 was not as bad as the third quarter of 2009. We produced a little more, okay? We don't know this yet. We haven't learned how much we produced in the last quarter. Why not? It's hard, it takes time, okay? You're trying to come up with the statistics of how much of a zillion goods and services we produced, okay? Now let's talk about this final bit. Here's the trick. Let's go back to the tomato soup example, okay? Did anyone drink tomato soup in Mozart last year? Can I see some hands? Who had tomato soup at Mozart? Wow, you need more tomato soup. But at least some people did, right? Okay, now, was that tomato soup produced in our country? Rather easy, yes, okay. Good, so should it be in the gross domestic product? Yes, okay, that's exactly what we're trying to come up with, right? How much we produced, what we produced. Now, here's the trick. Think of the tomatoes that went into that tomato soup, okay? Were they also produced in this country? Yes. Should their value also be in the gross domestic product? Yes. Let's say you paid, I don't actually know the answer to this. How much does a tomato soup in Mozart cost? 2 liras. Okay, say 2 liras, okay? And you say you bought the tomatoes for a kilo, okay, or like 1 liras for a kilo. Okay, and a kilo of tomatoes went into the soup. Now we produced tomatoes worth 1 lira. And we produced tomato soup worth 2 liras. What is the gross domestic product? There are 3 alternatives, right? 1, 2, and 3. Now, do we want the tomatoes to be in this measure? Why not? Didn't we produce them? The whole point was to come up with a measure of the production. We produced the tomatoes. In fact, you ate them, right? So they should be somewhere here, okay? How about the tomato soup? Do we want the tomato soup to be in the GDP? Yes, because we produced it, and you ate that too, okay? But you sense the difficulty here, right? The tomatoes and the tomato soup are not entirely different. When I say you ate the tomato soup, I'm already saying you ate the tomatoes, right? So this is exactly what this final goods idea is. When I say we produce tomato soup worth 2 liras, okay, I'm saying everything that went into that tomato soup, their combined value is 2 liras, okay? Am I already accounting for the value of the tomato? Yes, the tomato is in there, okay? So the GDP contribution is 2 liras, not 3 liras. So what it says is, you don't want to double count. You don't want to say, ooh, we produced wheat, we produced flour, and we produced bread. Let me add these 3 up, okay? No, the bread already has the flour and therefore the wheat in it, okay? If you're accounting correctly for the value of the bread, the flour and the wheat are accounted for. So what this says is, to avoid double counting, you don't want to say, I produce wheat, and then you look at the flour, I produce flour. Okay, let me add these up. No, no, no. The flour embodies, has in it, the value of the wheat. Okay? Since we're adding the values up, it's enough if I look at the value of the flour. If I look at the bread, then I should no longer look at the flour. Okay? That's the final goods. Now, this final goods idea is tricky, okay, for the following reason. Did you eat tomatoes last year? Yes. And you should. They're good for you. Should the value of the tomatoes you ate be in the GDP? Are those a final good? Yes. You ate them, right? But you also ate tomato soup. Should the value of the tomatoes in the tomato soup also be counted again in the GDP? No. So when you're talking about eating tomatoes, the tomato is the final good. When you're talking about having tomato soup, the tomatoes in the tomato soup are what are called intermediate goods, aramal. Okay? Final good, nihai ürün, son ürün. Intermediate goods, aramal. The same thing, depending on how you use it, who uses it, could be a final good or an intermediate good. Okay? Flour. You know, if you buy it to bake a cake at home, it's a final good. Because nobody observed you baking a cake. The last moment we see this thing transacted, bought and sold, is somebody bought flour. Okay? Goes into the GDP. But if I see this as sold as bread, then it's the bread that goes into the GDP. That's the idea of the final goods. Now, this is the part that creates the most problems for us, the monetary value. And the reason is the following. We're saying we're looking at the total monetary value of a bunch of things, right? We add them up. Okay. Now, when we do this for a year, this isn't too bad. It's okay to say, you know, last year Turkey's GDP was so much. Okay? But remember the graph I showed you, the Turkey versus Greece graph. Okay? There we were looking at things over time. Now, did the Turkish per capita, per person GDP increase? Yes. Remember, there was this gentle upward slope, right? The GDP is increasing. So should we understand from that that we're producing more goods and services? Well, that's what we would like to understand, but the gentleman here says no. Why?
Because of inflation and deflation.
Ah, because of inflation. So I haven't defined what inflation is, but the problem here is we said monetary value, okay? So what such graphs or such information tells us is we have produced more value, right? However, when we're talking about value, we're talking about two things, right? The quantity of something, which is what we're really interested in. What we want to say is we produced more apples, more heart surgeries, more 102 lectures, okay? But what we are able to say is the total value of these things was higher. Now, if I learn that the value is higher, does it automatically imply that the quantity is higher? It doesn't have to, right? Maybe the quantity is the same, but the value increased. Why? Because we're using prices to value things, right? Remember how we added the apples and oranges up? We said 5 liras worth of oranges, 10 liras worth of apples, okay? 1 kilo of each. Add them up, you end up with a monetary value of 15. Now let's say you still have a kilo of apples and a kilo of oranges, but now prices double. Oranges cost 10 liras, apples cost 20 liras per kilo. Could it happen? You're Turkish, right? I mean, duh. So, teaching this class is going to be much more difficult, say in 10 years' time, when the generation after you comes, who are less experienced with inflation. But you guys still remember the days when, you know, inflation is announced, every newspaper has this fire-spitting dragon that says the inflation monster raises its ugly head again, blah, 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 right? You grew up thinking that inflation is public enemy number one, okay? Perhaps not very incorrectly. But that makes our life difficult because while we want to keep track of quantities, we are able to keep track of values. And values change for two reasons, total values, right? The quantities changed or the prices changed. Can we be sure that what we're looking at is actually an improvement in the standard of living or actually a increase in the per capita production, okay? Not easy, right? It turns out we can do this. Why? Well, because we're smart people and we think really hard about this, because this is a really important problem, right? We want to say the following very simple sentence. Our country, on a per person basis, produced more this year compared to last year. Therefore, we get to enjoy more goods and services, right? This is a very basic thing that we should be curious about. Are we getting better off? Are we able to consume more, invest more, use more goods and services over time, right? This is a very, not perfect, but a very fundamental measure of well-being. Because your 101 lectures tell you that people like to consume, okay? And you may have noticed, you have to produce to consume. So production is the basic definition. Are we producing more or less this year compared to last year? This tells us that, well, we're producing more value. I don't care. I want to know whether we're producing more goods and services. Okay? Well, we could do this. How can we do that? The idea is the following. I'm going to give you an example of this, and that's going to make your life a lot easier. But I'm going to give you the more difficult thought process first. Okay? When I'm converting quantities into monetary values, when I'm saying I'm going to take the quantities of apples, multiply them by their price, I'm going to take the quantity of oranges, multiply them by their price, and I'm going to add these up, okay? Why am I doing this? Why am I multiplying them by the price? Really easy. Yeah, to be able to add them up, right? To be able to sum them up, okay? Does it matter when I collect those prices? Does it matter whether I'm looking, right? I know that throughout the year we produced, I don't know, 1 million tons of apples. And I have no idea whether it's a reasonable number or not, okay? And 3,000 hours of 102 lectures, okay? And I want to add these up. Does it matter whether I take the prices of apples and 102 lectures at the beginning of the year or at the end of the year? It should be clear to you that, well, it should matter for something, right? Given that there's a general tendency of prices increasing. If I measure them at the beginning of the year, okay, versus I measure them at the end of the year, and then use them on the same quantities, I'm going to find a higher GDP at the end of the year. Okay? And in fact, that's my problem in general. However, it should also be clear to you that it doesn't change the fact that I could use the prices at the beginning of the year to add things up, or I could use the prices at the end of the year to add things up. In both cases, they are values. Okay? So what we could do is to say, look, in 2008, I take 2008 prices and 2008 quantities, okay? I turn them into 2008 values, add those up. In 2009, I take 2009 prices and 2009 quantities. I turn them into 2009 values and add them up. I look at this and say, 2009 total value is higher than the 2008 total value, okay? And then you guys tell me that, wait, that's not right. Okay, well, that is right, but that doesn't mean that we produce more, okay? Because we don't know whether we are seeing this higher value because of higher quantities or higher prices, okay? What I could do is the following. This is going to sound counterintuitive first, but you're going to understand that this is a very beautiful and simple idea. The idea is this. The only reason I'm having problems is I'm changing two things at once, right? I'm changing quantities as I move in time, and I'm changing prices, okay? But what I want to see is just the effects of changing quantities, right? That was the whole point. What happened to our total production? What I could do is to come up with a measure that would answer the following question. What would GDP in 2009 be if prices hadn't changed at all? Let me ask the question again, and I'm going to let you think of this for a moment, okay? Whether the answer is good for anything. What would prices in what would the GDP in 2009 be if prices from 2008 to 2009 had not changed at all? If the 2009 prices were the same as 2008 prices? Yes. And that's exactly what we want. The answer would depend on the quantity, right? And that's exactly what we want to learn, right? Remember, we began by saying we want to understand what happened to our production. What happened to the quantities, okay? We want to be able to say we produced so much more goods and services in 2009 compared to 2008. We can't just look at the GDP to do this because the GDP combines prices with quantities. We want only quantities, okay? What we could do is to say, well, let's answer a different question. Let's answer the following. How would GDP have changed if prices had not changed at all? Can I answer this? So essentially, I'm asking the question, what would 2009 GDP be with 2008 prices? Is this a well-defined question? Do we understand what we're asking? I mean, I do, but do you understand what I'm asking? Do you? Let's try again. We have 2 years. Therefore, 2 prices and 2 sets of prices and 2 sets of quantities. Okay? We want to isolate the effect of changes in the quantities only. The gross domestic product says, I can tell you the total change generated by the changes in prices and changes in quantities, okay? That's not very satisfactory. Why? Because, you know, think of your weekly allowances, okay? In monetary terms, they must have gone up over the last 5 years, right? Your parents give you more money at the beginning of the week, this week compared to, you know, any week in 2005, okay? That doesn't quite mean that you get to buy more, because the price of everything is higher as well, right? That's what inflation is. What we want to know is what happened to your purchasing power, okay? This is a very similar question. What we want to know here is what happened to the production of apples and oranges and open heart surgeries and tomato soup and 102 lectures and haircuts and massages, okay? These are all things that we produce. The difficulty is their quantities change over time, which I want to know, okay? Their prices also change over time, which makes my life difficult. I could do the following. Let's say I had only one good, okay? Let me pick on someone. Which good? Pencil. It's a good exercise to think about the spectrum of things that we produce, okay? I mean, we produce a lot more interesting things than pencil. Maybe not more useful, but a lot more interesting things than cars and apples and pencils. Now, if I had only one good, I don't need any of this, right? I could just say we produced 10 pencils last year, 15 pencils this year, I'm done, right? But let's say I'm insisting on doing this value comparison, okay? Pencils. We are the pencil economy, okay? We produce pencils, we eat pencils, we use pencils. We only have pencils, okay? Not a good life, but a very good example. Let's say the first year the price is 1 per pencil, and in the second year it's 2. In the first year we produced 10 pencils, okay? And in the second year we produced 15. Now, value. In the first year we produced 10 liras worth of pencils. In the second year we produced 30 liras worth of pencils, if my math isn't wrong. And again, if my math isn't wrong, I'm going to look at the GDP, which is this, right? For a one good economy, this is the GDP. This is the, right? Why? Because the pencil is the final good. It's the only good. It's the final good. This is the total monetary value of that final good. That is the GDP. Good. I'm going to look at this and say, my GDP is 3 times higher. Have I produced 3 times more goods and services? That was easier, right? No. What is the problem? The price changed. So the whole question is, what could I do? I want a number that will tell me that the quantity increased only 50%. Okay? So I ask myself, why am I not getting the answer I want here? Okay? And the answer is obvious. Because I'm combining price changes with quantity changes. Now I'm saying, let me ask the following question. What would the 2009 GDP be if prices had not changed? Can I ask this question? Yes. And if prices haven't changed, then all of the changes that I observe have to come from quantities, which is exactly what I want. Okay? So this is, for that reason, called current value. Let me write this in larger letters. Current value. That is, so this is GDP calculated with current prices, today's prices. In 2008, 2008 prices. In 2009, 2009 prices. In 1947, 1947 prices. Okay? For each year, that year's prices. That is called current value. Okay? Current price. Does anyone know the Turkish for this usage of current? Cari. Okay? Cari fiyatlarla. So what I could do is I could do fixed prices. I could do fixed prices. So I could say with 2008 prices, okay, what is the value? What is the 2008 value? Really easy, right? 1 times 10 is still 10. For the year I pick as the base, right, for the year that I'm picking the prices, the current value and the fixed value are the same because it is the same year, it's the same prices, okay? But it's going to be different in 2009. Now I'm asking, what is the GDP in 2009 with 2008 prices? What is it? Very good. Why? Because it's 1 times 15 is 15. Okay? So with fixed prices, sabit fiyatlarla, with fixed prices, what happened to the GDP? It increased. Yes, it did. How much? 50%. Very good. Now, the good thing is, in this example, we know exactly what the right answer is, right? The answer is this. How much did the quantity increase? 50%. How much does the constant price GDP say it increased? 50%. Okay? This measure is known as the real GDP. And now you understand why this is called the real GDP, right? It tracks quantities. It doesn't combine price changes with quantity changes, okay? This item is known as the nominal GDP, okay? The nominal GDP is nominal. And in Turkish, surprise, surprise, the corresponding values are nominal, real. Okay? Nominal GDP is, question? Question? You could ask. It's a large class, but I can't talk for 2 hours straight, so you should ask. Nominal GDP is the basic measure of GDP, but it's not the most useful measure of GDP, okay? Because by looking at its changes, we don't learn anything. All we get to ask is, yep, something happened, but it's either prices or quantities, and they may even have moved in opposite directions, one of them changing by a lot. For example, you were like this tall, and I was like this tall in 2001. Okay, that's not right, actually, I was this tall. In 2001, right, we had this huge, huge, huge crisis, right? It was a terrible year. It just sucked, okay? And we're going to talk about this more in the coming weeks. But 2001, you shouldn't remember this from having lived it, but you should know this, living in this country, right? 2001 was a terrible year for our country. Unemployment went through the roof, right? Banks got bankrupt, factories closed down. It was just terrible, 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 okay? What happened to the nominal GDP? It increased like crazy, okay? Why? Inflation was 100%, okay? Quantities decreased by, say, 7%, okay? Prices increased by 100%. You look at the nominal GDP, okay, and it says, 2001 was great. Was it? No, it wasn't. You look at real GDP, that's how you learn. We produced less. Producing less is terrible. Why? Well, you get to eat less, which is not good, okay? You get to use less, which is not good. Ma'am? Yes, you get to consume less, and when I say eat, here consume. Yes, ma'am.
How about we're looking at the GDPs, but are we taking the prices of the 2000 for according to quantity, right? Quantity times 2000's price, or?
When I'm talking now about 2001. So when we take the 2000 price for 2001 and we compare the 2 years, we see that the GDP shrank. The real GDP is smaller, okay? If we don't do that, if we take the 2000 price for 2000, 2001 price for the 2001, look at the nominal GDPs, it gives the impression that our economy is actually larger. It wasn't, okay? That's why this is the useful measure. Now, before we give a short break, I want you to notice that there is one nominal GDP. When I say the 2009 nominal GDP, you know that you're looking at 2009 prices and 2009 quantities, okay? Real GDP isn't like that. When I say the 2009 real GDP, okay, which year's prices am I talking about? Does it have to be 2008? Can't it be 2005? Can't it be 1944? I could pick any year to fix the prices, right? So the real GDP always goes with real GDP with this year's prices. For example, the Turkey versus Greece lines that I showed you, those were real GDPs. Why? Because I'm a good economist, okay? I want to show you nominal GDP. And they were the real GDPs with 2005 prices. Okay? So it was 2005 prices, 1950 quantities. 2005 prices, 1951 quantities. 2005 prices, 1995 quantities. Okay? Those were the lines that you were looking at. And then that chart is even more striking because in real terms, Greece has been kicking our ass. Okay? And we have to understand how is it that once you cross a little tiny border, that doesn't mean anything actually. Okay? You begin to produce a lot more per person. That is one of the most important questions in economics. And we're going to talk about this in 2 weeks' time. But before that, we're going to take a 5-minute break and be here 9:45.